We are live. We are coming in with Aleks Svetski, Aleks Gladstein, and I'm Alex McShane. We are here to discuss democracy, or rather debate democracy versus Bitcoin. So just to give you a short introduction, in case you're new, Aleks Gladstein is the CSO of the Human Rights Foundation and also works with the Oslo Freedom Forum. He also writes amazing essays for Bitcoin Magazine, most recently, The End of Super Imperialism and The Quest for Digital Cash. Aleks Svetski is the CEO of Amber and runs the Bitcoin Times. He also writes amazing essays for us. Most recently, Bitcoin is Not Democratic, Part 1, Problems with Democracy. So the long and short of this debate is, I think it's fair to say Svetski is not too keen on democracy, and Gladstein isn't a fan of dictatorship. And so we're going to discuss that in the context of Bitcoin today. I thought maybe we could start with some definitions. If we want to start maybe with Svetski, what does democracy mean to you? And then we'll ask Alex the same question.
Alrighty. For me, democracy is kind of, if I had to sum it up, it's rule of the competent by the incompetent. And it's just it's a process. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to leave it at that. Rule of the competent by the incompetent, because the competent will always be a minority, and unfortunately, we'll have to carry the weight. So that would be, if I had to sum it up.
Okay. And Mr. Gladstein, your definition of democracy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the word means ruled by the people, and I know there's a lot of different ways to take that, but when I look at it from a political science point of view, I'm looking at a political structure that has a division of power, where there is not one person or group that controls everything. And different societies are built different ways, but in general, the reason I like political democracy, or what we call maybe like a market democracy or a liberal democracy, as opposed to a dictatorship or a kingdom, is that you have separation of power between the executive branch and maybe a judicial branch. You have institutions, you have property rights, you have things like free speech that grow out of having a division of power and a balance of power. There are many problems with democracy. People can still elect a government that will go invade and blow up another country. Oftentimes, democracy is a sham. Most of the time when people do a vote in the world today, it's completely fraudulent. Like in North Korea, like everybody votes and there's only one vote on the ballot, and that's Kim Jong-un. But that doesn't mean that that country is a democracy. So I'll leave it at saying that a democracy is a contested word. For me, it's describing a society where power is kind of divided, and where there are checks on the rulers from the people. And that reminds me a lot of Bitcoin. And I think that Bitcoin will be a very good check on the rulers by the people in the future. And that's why I think it's very kind of democratic. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so to address the obvious question, and you just got into this a little bit, can we have both Bitcoin and a working democracy? I guess why or why not?
Well, let's get Svetski's, because he wrote the article on it, right?
Well, I guess my question there quickly, Gladstein, is you said a check on the rulers. So
Yeah.
on a Bitcoin standard, who are the rulers?
So I've been thinking a lot about the Bitcoin standard, especially in the last, it's like almost 2 years since we did our little chat, right? So I think that probably a Bitcoin standard at first is still a fiat system where governments make money, but they peg it to Bitcoin. They have Bitcoin reserves, and their fiat currencies will only be worth anything if backing is credible. So I think that there's a world, at least in the near future, where the Bitcoin standard doesn't look that much different from today, with the exception of that, you don't really have central banks and institutions like the IMF and World Bank with very much power. because they can't just like magically create reserves. The reserves that the world will use will essentially be units of Bitcoin. You can make all kinds of monetary instruments on top of that. And I do think that democratic governments and dictatorships both will choose to like have both tight and easy money policies at different times
in relationship to Bitcoin,
in relation to how much Bitcoin they have.
Mm-hmm.
And the market will be the decider on how much to trust that, and it'll value different fiat currencies in different ways. But I do think that countries that are really strong with like not only the amount of Bitcoin they have on their balance sheet, but also just like the economic output they have, the amount of Bitcoin kind of infrastructure that they have, will be very well positioned. And I in that world, I don't really see why the political structures would change very much. But I would just note that that's kind of like, let's say, the next decade or so. I'm not thinking out like
that's
way
transitory. Okay, so you're talking transitory.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to speculate on what it could be in 50 years.
Okay, so what do you think happens? So would you agree on this statement that that governments are generally poor managers of money, poor managers of resources, and generally operate, if they were a business, they would be bankrupt, generally speaking. I mean, I'm yet to, and you can maybe prove me wrong here, but I'm yet to see a government operate profitably. Have you found one?
I think that, on the one hand, I want to agree with you, and say that yes, there's like vast incompetencies. However, governments, because they have a monopoly on violence, and can be disproportionately powerful versus other governments and institutions and citizens, have been quite good at quote unquote making a lot of money, right? Like my whole piece about super imperialism described how the United States essentially was able to demonetize gold and make everybody else use its debt as the world's currency. Like that's, and my article goes, I think, at great pains to explain why that wasn't like necessarily an exactly planned process. A lot of that just kind of happened, and it wasn't like Nixon and Kissinger were total geniuses. Okay, they like in figuring out this devious system. They almost kind of backed into this. But all I'm saying
I would
is
actually,
I guess just to conclude, the U.S. government has figured out a way, yes, to like to like manage the money system in a way that benefits it tremendously. I would say yes.
It's funny because I totally agree with you on the idea that that none of these things happen in some pre-planned lizards behind red curtain situation, but I think they're generally a result of things like democracies. So like because there is a tendency, like entropy, for example, I call it, it's the overwhelming force that breaks the human body down over time. It cools hot water and it turns all governments into a downward spiraling tyranny of the lowest common denominator, because they're kind of positioned in such a way that they naturally devolve, and in a bid to survive, they have to naturally continue to find new methods of extraction. So like what you described then about the US government creating, super imperialism and, forcing everyone onto the, US dollar standard. I wouldn't say that that was really a value add. I would say that that was a value extraction,
Sure.
a net value extraction.
I agree.
And,
but you would say it's impressive, correct? Like it was impressive that they did that.
Absolutely.
That was very, like in hindsight, very competent that they did that. Like that was impressive. It helped them defeat the Soviets, right? Like that was impressive.
It was a more sophisticated form of theft, I would call it. So,
Totally.
Communism is a far more incompetent form of theft because, they basically steal first and then people can't produce and then they will die of starvation. Whereas in democracy, it's kind of like give them some room, let them produce, then steal later, right? So it's kind of like switching the order of things.
And it's interesting because I don't think like Michael Hudson, who writes the super imperialism thesis, he doesn't really spend time on the political structure of the classic imperialists versus the Americans. But what he does say is that the classic imperialists operated out of like a net creditor position. Like they had all the money and all the resources. Whereas the unique thing about America has been that we've been able to run the world out of a net debtor position, which is like fascinating. Like we've been able to get all these other countries to pay for our wars and our social programs, which is unjust, unfair, not sustainable. It's breaking. It's going to break. But it had a really good run, and it was like a very impressive system. So I guess I agree that, like, in a kind of broad sense, that like bureaucrats don't manage money as well as actual money managers with skin in the game. Like, if you're not managing your own money, I agree, you're going to do like a poorer job of it. I 100% agree. However, from like a macro sense, like it's hard to argue that the powers that be,
succeeded in this form
haven't succeeded one way or the other, over the years, with massive negative externalities. I will go in a little bit to, let's say, bring it up to what's happening right now. Some people argue, a lot of people's criticism of, like, let's say, U.S. monetary policy is that the Fed is not accountable, or like the Fed is not part of the democracy, right? I don't really buy that. I feel like the Fed is an arm of the U.S. government, works together with the Treasury. This is super obvious to me. And like I think they actually, to your argument, I think they react to the public pressure of the majority, and then they bend the knee. So like, I think that what you're seeing right now is like people freaking out about inflation, right, in America. And therefore, the Fed is going to react to that, and is at least saying they're going to raise rates. I mean, we'll see what happens. But they're like clearly reacting to what this majoritarian feeling, right? That's an interesting thing to consider, alongside the other insight, which is that the Fed, in my opinion, has basically focused on, pre-pandemic at least, had kind of gotten away with, since the Greenspan era, focusing on asset inflation while trying to avoid price inflation. And this allowed them to enrich the elite in a tremendous way that maybe like the average person didn't really notice, because they weren't seeing, like, between 2000 and 2015, you weren't really seeing huge like price inflation in like meat or oil or whatever, or basic things you were eating. But like the freaking stock market, real estate, like, over time, I went up crazy amounts. So there's like an argument to be made that more recently, the Fed's policy has almost been anti-democratic. Like it's been like helping the elites at the expense of the people, and now people are starting to see what's actually going on. So I think there's a lot of ways you could take this.
Yeah, can we just draw one line there? Is I really want to, and this is maybe separate but related to our conversation around democracy, but I really want to change the terminology around elites. Like, for me, the word elite implies being exceptional at something. So like Usain Bolt is elite, Bruce Lee was elite, Murray Rothbard was an elite thinker. Elite is someone who is exceptional. Like, what I like to call these people is parasites. I think that's a far better.
Okay, I'll say rent-seeking bureaucrats. How's that?
Yeah, which is another word for parasites. Yeah, but yeah. So I'll be a little bit more pointy, but I really want to, because I actually believe in a form of natural elitism, which is some people are naturally better at things than other people are, and as a result will amass, whether it's extra wealth, extra status, extra whatever, not through a process of leeching it from others, but becoming the best version of themselves. So Usain Bolt didn't become the fastest man in the world because he walked around and broke everyone's legs and then beat them at the 100-meter race. Like, he fucking trained his ass off. That is what I consider elite. So in that sense, I think what drives humanity forward and what drives a species forward is the capacity for individuals to become the best versions of themselves, and do that off their own back and become elite. And I think that that reaching for excellence, that reaching for elitism, is a powerful thing. And what's happened is particularly over the last 10, 20, 30 years, elitism has been conflated with parasitism. And what we do is we when we think of elite, we think of fucking Christine Lagarde, who hasn't produced or created anything in her life other than stolen from millions of people without their consent. And I think what we end up doing is we end up then viewing the people who are the best in their fields as some kind of like, we view them in the wrong light, basically. Instead of aspiring to be elite, what we do is we start to aspire to be average.
Sure.
We start
So
to
to
aspire to
borrow
become.
from our friend Alan Farrington, what I'm describing is like the neo-feudal structure. I'm really talking about the aristocrats. Now, are some of them smart? Sure, but like a lot of them aren't. I guess my counter to that would be, I do agree with you, of course, that you're describing like what happens in human nature. And I don't think Bitcoin, like like clearly, like people who are good at something are going to be able to amass more Bitcoin who aren't. I think the interesting thing about Bitcoin, and the reason I would say it's like kind of almost democratic in a way, building off my definitions, is that what happens in time, over history, is that people who are really good at stuff, they begin to be able to change the rules of the game. And like, you know, the British were like really smart at certain things, smarter than other countries. And maybe that was like fair at the beginning, but they used that advantage to make a system that was unfair and benefited only them. And this goes all the way down to like the micro in your own communities. Like this is obviously the argument, the age-old argument of like progressivism, right? So
rules and rulers, basically.
right. And the reason why I think Bitcoin has sort of got this interesting progressive or almost democratic kind of quality to it is that it prevents elites, whether they are your definition of elite or aristocrats, undeserving, whether they are deserving or undeserving elites, it prevents them from changing the rules of the monetary game. And I think that that's a historic first. Like gold kind of did that, but gold was easily centralized and confiscated and looted and you know, put into the hands of a few. If Bitcoin continues on its trajectory, not so easily. No. Like the people will have the ability to have it. So I think that that's what what's what I'm really talking about when I'm talking about Bitcoin as like democratic or progressive. It's that it is a check against accumulated power and against arbitrary power. And I think that natural elitism, you know, inevitably leads to these unequal power structures because some people are better at doing stuff than others. I agree with you on that.
I would add just some color to that, in that I would separate economic power from political power. So I think what it does is it places a check on political power, but it doesn't place a check on economic power. And that's good because economic power should be compounded. If you're continually and consistently adding value or producing something or creating something, you should be able to continue to amass and build economic power, and that's fine. But what it does is it actually, and this is where I kind of want to take a little bit of the discussion, is I actually want to separate politics from economics, because I don't view them in the same class. I view economics as the organic process of transforming chaos into order, which is what all species do, whether it's a fucking mycelium, an amoeba, you know, some, you know, eukaryote, or a human being. Like what we do is we continue to increase our biological carrying capacity by taking energy, resources, and time and transforming it into something of higher order value. And that's what life does. Like life is an economic process. It moves, it progresses forward in taking this stuff. Politics, on the other hand, is an attempt to try and direct or control or to manage this organic process. And that's something that is, you know, as far as we understand, more a human thing. It's like, you know, we're trying to outsmart the complex process of life. We're trying to outsmart the complex process of economics, in which, you know, individuals act towards ends they deem valuable, and in an intersubjective world, we trade in order to meet those ends and get somewhere, right? Politics takes the standpoint of, all right, we must reduce all of the constituents of this society, of this territory, into some sort of quantifiable metric, so like a number, and then we must direct that in some sort of way. You know, we must take the individuals and, for example, give them all a vote, and give them all the same say. And at some point, I want to sort of dig into voting without, you know, derailing here, but it's like those two things, I just see them as opposite ends of the spectrum. Economics on one side is like an organic process. Politics is an artificial process of trying to direct an organic process, which always turns into a clusterfuck. And for me, what Bitcoin does is it swings society or swings life or it swings humanity back into the realm of economics, not of politics. And for me, that is the hugest impact. And in that world, in a world of economics, all of it, communism, socialism, fucking fascism, democracy, the whole lot goes out the fucking window. We start to redefine relationships amongst people. And that's kind of the challenge that I put forth to you, is to sort of start to think beyond what we've used to date to organize people.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I largely agree with you on that argument. I mean, I think that pre-Bitcoin, all money was political. There weren't really free markets, especially in the last 100+ years, because the US government or other governments would control those markets and, you know, would engineer or centrally plan the money system. So Bitcoin, I agree, like kind of breaks that trend and is as neutral and apolitical as possible, essentially, as a monetary system. So I do agree there. I guess I still feel that it tilts the direction of power to people, individuals, as opposed to like rulers or aristocrats. And that's really what I mean by democratic. I don't mean a vote, although voting is a part of it. What I really mean is like, where's the power? Is the power with the people who hold the, you know, the people or the public, or is the power with a small group of rent-seeking aristocrats? And today, the power of the purse is with a small group of rent-seeking aristocrats. It's just they get to make the rules of the money, and they're not elected in any way. And most people are like basically through things like what's called Fed speak. They don't know what's going on with the money. Like the Federal Reserve, as an example of the largest central bank in the world, has intentionally hidden what it does behind complicated language so that the average person doesn't understand what's happening. This is like well documented.
Yeah,
starting
they got their own fucking language.
Yeah, and it's like
hilarious.
Okay, whatever, quantitative easing. Like the average person doesn't know what that is. So they're like, sounds good, man. Like, great, you go ahead and fix that. So again, Bitcoin is like a check on that aristocratic kind of like, let's say, fake elite power, and that's why I like to use the word democracy, or rather democratic, to kind of describe it. But I do kind of agree with what you just laid out.
Okay, so coming back to the elite point, and this is the last piece I want to touch here before I want to ask another question around representative government. But so to the elite point, so yes, it again, I really like to define and separate economic power versus political power, and Bitcoin fundamentally places a check on political power. So if you're a true elite or a natural elite, someone exceptional at your craft, whatever dimension that craft may exist in, do you think it's fine for you as that individual, that entity, to amass disproportionate wealth and economic power as a function of your input into society, like, and the fact that other people might find that valuable?
No, I don't think that. I think that is what happens in the world, and I think that using violence to try and stop that is not good.
Hold on. I don't, maybe you didn't understand my question. So I said, do you think it's okay for a natural elite to amass disproportionate power as a function of adding value into the marketplace?
Yeah, yes. What I mean by that is yes, and using violence to stop that is bad.
Okay, good. All right, that's what I thought you meant. Because
yeah, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Cool. All right, so we're on the same page. So do you agree that in that sense, Bitcoin is less about the people and more about the individual being able to make the most for themselves? Because this is where I guess maybe the line where we need to see if there's a common ground is, because I actually don't, where I kind of define Bitcoin is it's kind of like a meritocratic or individualist thing. It's like I can be the best version of myself, and I don't have to care about the people, and I don't give a fuck what they vote for or think or decide. I can produce what can be the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a civil liberties or individual rights thing. That's why it's called individual rights, right? It's like, what can you do? People like me believe that, like, when you look at modern history, the societies where people tend to have the most individual rights in terms of, like, let's say property rights or free speech or right to associate, et cetera, et cetera. These tend to be in societies that have voting and democracies. And quite obviously, if you live in a dictatorship or an authoritarian or autocratic regime where one person gets to make all the decisions, people don't really have individual rights. There's just less checks and balances and less ways to protect individualism in those countries. In fact, a lot of ideologies that come out of these authoritarian regimes seek to destroy individualism. And I would caution to differentiate between mob rule, which would be like populist authoritarianism, which would be like Hugo Chavez or Erdogan or something like that, where you have like the majority of the people supporting a dictator, kind of, and they're all riled up and they love the dictator. That's very different in my mind from like a society that has actual checks and balances. Like what Chavez or Erdogan did to get what they had at their peak or whatever was get rid of the checks and balances. They got rid of the businessmen. They got rid of the media. They got rid of all the people getting in their way. And they were supported by, quote unquote, the people. That's mob rule. And that's not friendly to individual rights or freedoms. But I would argue institutions and checks and balances are very, very, very important for individual rights and freedoms. And Bitcoin is like a tremendous check on government power, just like an incredible one.
What if those institutions are, economically incompetent? Should they exist?
I think that Satoshi certainly didn't think that they should, right? I think should is a funny word because what we think about doesn't really matter,
True.
right? In the long term, I like with the introduction of Bitcoin, we're kind of on a track now where eventually, like I believe at least, like there won't really be central banking, so there won't really be an opportunity for a small group of people to like control the money. Like it'll be something that is like taken from them. And I think that that's very healthy for humanity in a lot of ways.
Okay, so let's take this down. So I've got a question here. Is like, do you think democracy has a scale problem?
I mean, if we're to use my definition of like a liberal or market democracy that has checks and balances and a balance of power, no. I mean, arguably what a lot of people would point to as like the most effective democracy is one of the largest countries in the world, the United States, in terms of how it breaks up its power, like how states have power in the United States and how even mayors have power, and where the federal government can't just like come in and do whatever it wants. Where like, where there's this idea of kind of like, states' rights and things like that. So I think that has scaled reasonably well. The CCP has also scaled a different political system reasonably well, like communist authoritarianism, right? So India has a very messy democratic system that I don't think is working very well. But I think its problems stem from the fact that it's too corrupt and doesn't have enough institutions, not that it's not authoritarian enough. So I think that like basically what I'm saying is like societies where people have some sort of check and balance over their government seem to scale fine. I don't see a problem there.
Interesting, because I see a huge problem with the scalability in America. I mean, we had so I guess.
Well, compared to what though? Like we have to compare to apples and apples here. Like how would you, if you're critiquing American democracy, I'm with you. It's hugely flawed, but like, what's better? What's a better, let's call it 100 million person country that's run better?
I would say a no country whatsoever,
That's
in like
fair.
this United States of America.
Well, that's fine, but that's theoretical, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So do you think there's a scale problem? Because I guess where I want to go with this is like, do you think a democracy can scale to 300 million people? Because I think if anything, I mean, just the last apparent election showed like you've got 70 million people that wanted one thing, another 70 million that wanted something else. And now they're all sort of under one banner. And like, I don't know, that to me doesn't look like it scales.
Correct. I mean, it's like the Churchill thing, right? It's like the worst of the best of all the worst options. Like it doesn't scale well. You're right. I mean, But I mean, I'd rather have that than live under fucking Xi Jinping, who can just decide to just take a whole bunch of people and put them in prison camps. Like I think that there's, there's theoretical speculative stuff we can discuss, and then there's like the reality of the world today. And I just think that liberal democratic structures have delivered better freedoms to people than other models of government. I think that like part of my big thesis is that like actually Bitcoin is very American. Like if you read the Declaration of Independence, you think about things like free speech, property rights, open capital markets, commerce, free trade. Bitcoin really reverberates with all of those values, and those are like what separate us from like a communist, like fascist state.
Can I step in there really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wonder, like, in light of, I mean, where does like locking people in their homes for the last 2 years, debasing their currency, I mean, it would seem to me that our democracy isn't in line with those values at all.
Well, first of all, you have to, again, nothing's in a vacuum. You'd have to compare us to other large countries, right? And I would say that I don't know, man. I live in California. I've never been locked in my home. I've got to use Bitcoin, so my currency is not debased. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if you live in China, you don't have those fucking options, man. Like, you really have to compare.
What about Australia?
You have to compare Tibet to Texas. You really do. Like, you got to think hard about that. Well, you know more about that than me. I mean, I think Australia is gonna reap, is laying the seeds for its own future, and I think people are quite upset about that in many ways.
Do you think the people who didn't vote and didn't want to be represented by this government should be paying for that?
I mean, it's hard to say, because like, okay, so let's say Australia was a kingdom. How do we know that king would have made a different decision? I mean, there's plenty.
King's easy to kill.
Well, I'm just saying there's plenty of examples of autocracies that had much more vicious lockdowns than Australia. It's just
debatable. But
freaking China, man, to China. So I mean, the world's biggest one. And it's not like you have like a choice. You have to listen. And I don't know. I think that in America, again, it's very flawed. I think that going to war with Iraq is a much worse crime than like public health stuff in the last 2 years. Like I have opinions about that, but like, and like the surveillance state that we have and what Snowden revealed, and just like the ongoing loss of our freedoms that we're about to have. The Fed just announced its like first step towards talking about a CBDC that's coming. Like,
so would you not agree that they're all results though of democracy? Because see, my argument is America was great long before it had democracy and long before democracy existed. In fact, human beings have been producing and creating stuff, and prosperity is actually a function of free trade and collaboration amongst individuals who free and have some private property rights. For me, democracy is an addendum. So I think what ends up happening is we go and take and conflate democracy with prosperity of the free markets. And America, for example, because it was a frontiers land, and because it was a place in which there was very little government in the beginning, like basically fuck all from a government standpoint, but you had the spirit of the free individual sort of go there. And you had particularly, I think, two things, or maybe probably three things really drove America forward from an economic standpoint was electricity, oil, and steel, more than anything else. Like democracy just turned out to be this parasite that kind of hitched on for the ride and took all the credit for the prosperity of the free markets.
Dude, slavery, man. I mean, that's what our country was built on. And I don't agree.
That is completely false, because
dude, come on. I mean,
absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because all the slaves combined could not over 100 years produce what, from an energetic standpoint. I would recommend you read Energy and Civilization, which is a discussion of like how we evolve as human beings and how we progress forward. And it looks at progression or civilization through the purely objective mathematical lens of energy output. It is totally impossible for you to amass economic power in the modern age through slavery. Slavery is uneconomical. You like America really leaped from horses first, then the application of steam, and then the discovery of oil. That's what made America a superpower, not fucking slavery. It was those countries, it was those economies that moved on to far denser energy, harnessing far denser energy mediums that completely leapfrogged the rest of the world, because slavery existed everywhere. Like if with that argument, like Brazil should have been a superpower, but Brazil's a fucking clusterfuck. So because America had the frontiers approach, and you had Nikola Tesla.
The reason Brazil's a clusterfuck is because it doesn't have the democratic institutions, and it had a bunch of military dictatorships in the last 100 years, and they fucked over the country and destroyed the currency. Like, I would say that civilizationally speaking, I agree. We don't need slavery or genocide to get to where we want to go. But you can't just leave that out of the story. I mean, we killed off and took the land of all these people, and we enslaved a whole bunch of others. And slavery can be very lucrative. I mean, look what the French do in the West Africa, or like from a colonialism was massively lucrative. I mean, I don't know, like massively lucrative. I mean, trillions of dollars were just stolen by the British, by the Germans, by French, all over the world over hundreds of years, and it wasn't due to just engineering like superiority. Like they literally just
the engineering superiority is what gave them the initial superiority, and then they used that through the application of politics to then go and steal more from people. So basically, you had this initial amassing of economic power through the application of science, math, and engineering into technology, which then gave them excessive economic power, which then they transformed the economic power into political power.
Exactly.
Under whatever
but that's the part that we should dive into, because that's what I think Bitcoin can help address. Like basically,
Totally.
once you have a head start in one area for whatever reason we could debate about that, but like then it just becomes like there's a disadvantage, right? So you have in America, like obviously for all the many different reasons, like the legacy of our anti-democratic elements of our founding, have created a situation where we have a bank system that's extremely discriminatory towards like certain minorities in a way that's very anti-free market and extremely exclusionary and selective. And that's all just fucked up. And I think that what's cool is that Bitcoin is just like open and neutral. And
do you know what? I would actually push back. I would say it's only fucked up insofar as that they can then socialize the consequence of that decision. So if I'm a bank and I'm a private banker, and I choose to say discriminate, I don't like fucking yellow people or purple people or whatever the fuck, and I don't want to give them loans, I should be free to do so. There should be no law prohibiting me to do so. But simultaneously, for my bad decisions, I should not be able to go to the central bank and then just get bailed out. You know what I mean? So what will happen is discrimination has its own market equilibrium, is that if you're a cunt to a specific group of people or whatever dimension you want to use, you basically, A, should not get their business, and B, the person who you're just being a fuckwit to should not lower themselves to give you their business.
Yeah, I mean, in a pure free market, maybe that's the way that works. But as we've been discussing, like we haven't lived in that. Yeah. And we've lived in a world where the people who had all the economic power created political
transformed
power
it into political power. Totally. Yeah. Okay. So this is somewhere we can agree. So I would actually throw that through the lens of the sovereign individual thesis, right? It's like, it's a period in history where the returns to violence were such that you could concentrate power and use economic power to amass political power. And then basically, I mean, even through, a Marxist lens, the bourgeois emerged from, in his words, asunder the feudal system, tore it down, but in the process then turned into the same fuckwits that they apparently tried to tear down, and built their own models of power All they did was they placed a new banner on it saying democracy or for the people, every person gets a fucking vote. And, you know, for me, like one of the biggest strange things, like, you know, something that I can't reconcile in my head is this idea of like a representative government. Like, you know, so for example, in a democracy, you know, you as the person being represented have no option not to be represented. So like whether you choose not to vote or, you know, vote in the opposite direction, you still wind up being represented by someone
and in
or
your country,
somebody
in Australia, you like have to vote or you get penalized, right?
Exactly. Yeah, dude, it's fucked up. So it's like, so, you know, I used to just go in there and just draw a penis on the thing. And, you know, like the thing is, it's just wild. So that kind of, that you're represented irrespective of what you want turns into what I kind of call like this behavioral decay. Like, you know, you have a choice, is you either steal or be stolen from. And then that's where it kind of creates an incentive for otherwise competent and capable people to move into politics instead of to move into some sort of productive application of their skill, which is again a function of where we are in the absence of economic power being the peak form of power instead of political. And again, that's what Bitcoin changes. Bitcoin obsoletes political power and makes economic power great.
I think for the audience, like if we just bring it back to Bitcoin for a second, you could think about being like a Bitcoin user, right? And like, we don't live in a hyper Bitcoinized world yet. We live in the pre Bitcoin era still, basically. So the reality is that you have to think about like, well, what jurisdiction would I want to be a Bitcoin user in? And there's a little bit of a risk game here, right? Because first of all, we have the dichotomy between like, where do we want the mining infrastructure? And there's a big debate over this, right? People like me like thought it was bad that like more than half the mining infrastructure was in China because it's a communist country. There's no checks and balances. They could have just done whatever they want. And we saw them do what they did. And you know what? That sucked for all those miners. Like they had to fucking leave, right? The United States could do something similar, but it's like less likely. There's like lobbyists and we have like the media and we have all these things. And it's like, it's less likely that the US government is just going to like get rid of mining. That's less likely because we're in a democratic society. So I think that's one interesting angle. The other one is that like, for now, okay, maybe you're a Bitcoin user and you don't like the tax law in America, so you want to go somewhere else. Well, you have to think carefully about where you're going. Like, are you going to go to Portugal? Okay, has favorable tax law. It's a democratic society, right? Are you going to go to El Salvador? Very interesting. Okay, so very favorable. However, you're entirely at the whim of Bukele. Now, Bukele could change his mind. Bukele could get toppled. Anything could happen to Bukele. So you're wedding like your rights and future to one person. And that's not ideal, I think. So when you're thinking about where do I want to be as a Bitcoin user, I have a feeling most of these people are going to gravitate towards democracies, maybe with the exception of like Dubai. And look, if you live in Dubai, I think you just got to know you live in a slave state. Like everything is made by essentially slaves. And the regime there, the fake elite or whatever, the aristocrats who run Dubai, have an economic incentive to attract foreigners and to make it feel like it's a beautiful place and a paradise and a party and everything. So they're probably not going to fuck with you as a rich foreigner if you're in Dubai. But that system is totally fucked up under the surface. Totally fucked up. It's crazy. So, I mean, I think you have to think about as a Bitcoin user, where do you want to be, right? And I think that in the end, like democratic systems are pretty well aligned with Bitcoin users, and authoritarian ones are tricky, I guess would be my argument.
Yeah, okay. I mean, to the Dubai point, I mean, if they didn't have oil and some sort of energy density in the form of oil, the no amount of slavery would have turned that into a nice place. But so I don't know if it's a function of slavery or if it's a function of oil and resources. But how that oil was extracted.
It's a rentier state, like it's
what does that mean?
Meaning like it's a state that bases its power on rent seeking from the production and export of oil. That's coming to an end at some point, right? Like they're arguably like tilting more towards other kinds of services, right? Finance, acquisitions, trying to do technology, all kinds of stuff. Everything they want you to believe,
I mean, who else is a state that uses oil petrodollar as a mechanism for control? I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, no, and I've documented that well.
I know you have.
I'm just saying, like, as a Bitcoin, as an end user, like, you just got to be careful when you're kind of simping for authoritarianism, because like you never know, they can just change their mind, like, and there's nothing you can do about it. And in America, it's true, we can talk about Ross and stuff like that, and those are important conversations, but generally speaking, there's stuff you can do about it. Like you can fight back.
Yeah, I would say it's less bureaucracy. It's more democracy, just in the way. Sorry.
I've got a friend who got like fucking like black bagged and put in a dungeon and then sent out of Dubai. Like that's the kind of stuff they do over there, you know?
Yeah. I mean, actually, here's a question. So, if you have a community, let's say you own a community, you got multiple houses in there, and you're the private owner of that, and then someone comes in and starts causing trouble, do you have the right to black bag him?
I mean, the right.
Well, should you be able to black bag him?
I mean, I like to zoom out.
Or would you black bag him?
Right. Okay. So
no, I would.
like I operate with the framework that like essentially like private businesses are kind of able to do what they want to an extent, right? I don't think that what Twitter does is necessarily censorship, because it doesn't have an army and it can't black bag people. So it's a choice that a company makes, and we can be upset about it. I think where we'd be worried about it is if we were going to try to make the argument that Twitter has now become part of the government. Okay, then it gets very interesting, right?
Yeah.
But as far as like your community, I don't know, you're going to have community rules, and I think that everything's a social contract, right? I would prefer to live in a place where if someone tried to, like, for any reason, torture or commit violence against another person, you know, that I would want to live in a society that had some sort of police force that could deal with that, like, and that I would want to pay tax dollars to fund that police force and live in a place where I had police protecting me. That's just my take. I know that there's some kind of anarcho-capitalist types out there that wouldn't want that, or that would want to live in a place where they had to pay. They would pay itemized for everything.
Yeah,
so I'm going to pay for my private security and all this stuff. That's
or a membership fee or something like that.
Sure, I think that's a fair dispute. But generally speaking, I'd want to live in a society where, like, if you're in a bar and someone upsets the bartender, that the bartender can't just like shoot the person. No, or like, no. I would hope to not live in that kind of society.
Not to defend the black bagging of your friend, but do you think in some way, shape, or form, Dubai as a relatively, privately owned domain, may have black bagged him for a similar reason to a business owner black bagging someone fucking around in their bar?
Well, this person was
again, I'm not defending that either.
No. I'm just saying that this person was attacked because he was criticizing the governments of the region, which are allied with Dubai, and he was loud about it, and they didn't like that. But I just think that the Dubai model is really horrifying when you look at the full spectrum, when you don't have your blinders on, when you actually look at the full spectrum of what it is and how it operates and how it works. It's certainly not what I would hope humanity is heading towards. Like, that would be a fucking disaster, in my opinion. Other people may, meaning it requires, you realize that like less than 10% of the population of these Gulf countries, some of these Gulf countries, is actual citizens. Everyone else is just a worker. So if you're okay with that model, this like kind of neo-feudal model, go for it. You're going to love it. But if you're not, if you want to like move beyond Bitcoin neo-feudalism into a renaissance where there's like a middle class and there's like power balances against the rulers, so they can't just do whatever you want, then you don't like that model, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay. I kind of want to dig there, but I wanted to go somewhere else first. Um, what's can we dig into voting a little bit?
Sure.
In your mind, what's voting used for or useful for?
Yeah.
Maybe there's two
So
questions there.
when I think again about a democracy, or what we would call a liberal democracy or market democracy today, to me the foundation is free speech, and then on top of that you have like separation of powers and civil society. At the very top, almost like the cherry on top, is voting. Like voting is a mechanism to replace the people in power. If you don't have these things underneath it, it's freaking useless. Again, every single dictator gets elected, almost all of them to a T. Voting itself is useless if it does not have these things underneath it. So I think voting can be a useful mechanism to like regularly replace the people in power so that they can't rule forever and turn their, as we've been discussing kind of before, turn their economic power into like more political power. Like, generally speaking, I'm someone who believes that there should be like term limits on rulers, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, if for nothing else. Yes, once in a while, you're going to get this brilliant leader who we all want to be in power forever. That's just like very rare though. Like usually like people go bad, they go rotten. So to me, voting is like this mechanism that liberal democracy societies use, or communities, cities, whatever, use to just replace the people in power so that one person doesn't become emperor. That's the way I would define it.
Do you, okay, so man, I want to do a counter definition, but I want to ask a question in there, which is, do you think the term limits pose a danger of removing skin in the game? So what I mean by that is, a bureaucrat as a representative who knows that they only have, say, 4 years or 8 years,
Yeah,
because they don't have any relationship to the capital, the property that they're representing, that they basically, it's an unconscious economic calculation of, I can increase cash flow at the expense of capital because I have no cost of the capital because I'm just a representative who's in place for a certain number of years. Do you think there's a danger in that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, that's kind of like why, like, people have this short-term time preference when they're like a president or a senator. They have like their whatever 4 years or 8 years or whatever it is, and that leads to short-term thinking. I do agree with that, and that's why like some societies have tried to create stuff like the Supreme Court, where like you rule for life and until you die. And I think that you want a mix of the two. Like in a good society, you want part of the government to be rule for life, and you want part of it to be have some sort of term limits. I think that's a good compromise. Again, you will occasionally find a brilliant leader who defies everything and for decades is on point and cares deeply about their society and everything like that, and truly loves the people and all this stuff. It's more like a Disney character. Usually
Totally.
you're more likely going to get somebody like Bashar al-Assad, right? And you can make that argument about, oh, well, look at like a Putin or a Xi Jinping. Haven't they made their countries great? Geopolitically, yes, that they're improving the geopolitical footprint of their country and in different metrics, but you have to look at the costs. I mean,
Yeah, well, that's kind of like your original argument about America becoming, an economic superpower by forcing everybody to use their money and extracting wealth from it and everything. It's like, they used they used extractive political methodologies to become a power, and then now China and Russia are, doing their own version of that, to do the same thing, to amass political power.
yeah, I mean, the cost of China's rise is Xinjiang. Like that's like apparently a cost, because if it wasn't necessary to the model of China, of the harmonious society, then they wouldn't be conducting persecution of ethnic minorities. It wouldn't. Why would they do it? It's so expensive. Like occupying Tibet and Xinjiang is expensive as hell. Why? For a lot of different reasons, including global, obviously, as you see PR lately. Why would they be doing that? Well, because they have to, because it's so important to the model of their governance. So
yeah,
generally,
politics over economics again.
Yeah. So I tend to think that what you bring up is a very good, very, very valid concern. Presidents certainly have a very short-term time preference. I think, ironically, this is why in a lot of institutions, like again, Supreme Court, lower down at places like the State Department, you know, people are supposed to be like either life appointees or like careerists, right? Where it's not like they get canned if the government changes. It's kind of funny that in the American system, the careerists are the kind of the peons, and then like the rulers are the ones that keep switching, right? There's different ways to do it, but I certainly think that in a Bitcoin standard, the behaviors of people when it comes to thinking about the future will just change, will certainly change. And I guess I would push back against this idea that like unrestrained from term limits or whatever, that these autocrats or kings will have like a golden age for their society. I mean, that's always the history of the person who, like, the winners write history, right? So the golden age was golden, yeah, for some people, but it really fucking sucked for a lot of other people. Yeah, so totally. I think that's kind of what I'd want to get at is like, democratic institutions, the goal is to remove the possibility of a fascist for life, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah. So well, I agree that term limits have a problem. I think also on the flip side is like the careerists also have a real problem, is because if you know you've got a career job, you basically got,
yeah, why should I perform well?
Correct, exactly. So then it's once again economically abhorrent.
You could make it based on goals and achievements, and then you're more like a job, right? Like in the private sector, right?
Yeah, sort of. Except, but you know, when you write your own goals because you know you're part of the political apparatus, then it doesn't fucking matter. So I guess, you know, I mean, my argument is that you know, as Bitcoin begins to dominate, what ends up happening is society begins to fracture and the world looks more like, you know, 1 million city-states as opposed to 200 mega countries. But that, like, before we even get there,
mm-hmm.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into this voting thing. So you mentioned voting is used as a tool for rotating power. Like, would that be a good summation?
But emotionally, it's used to like lead the public to believe that they have some choice. And look, like, obviously for hundreds of millions of people, they enjoy that, whether or not you think it's valid or not. That is a right they really enjoy. Like, when you look at a country where some people are able to vote and others can't, the people that can't are really pissed and they'd love to be able to vote. So you could look at like American history, you could look at these Gulf states where these workers can't vote or participate in any decision making. I think it's kind of like having a seat at the table, and whether or not you think that that's true at all, it does matter for people. Like, people don't like to not be able to vote if other people can vote. It's just sort of like a natural human thing.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, the feeling of being left out. So okay, so could I then make an extension to your statement that so voting is used to rotate power, but that's still a means to a more important end, which is the end of rotating power is so that you can somehow influence or decide the use of resources and energy of society. Is that really sort of the end state? I mean, of why someone votes?
Again, I have a perspective. I'm a sort of human rights activist. There's people have many different perspectives on this, but my interpretation of why we would have voting is to prevent authoritarianism, is to help prevent like an accretion of power at the top. Now, that's not the fair criticism of American democracy or whatever, is that it's not working. Like, regardless of the whole voting, and there was a great rant on this by, I think, a comedian, what was his name, Jim Brewer or something, like that went viral a couple months ago. But like, the whole voting thing can distract people from what's actually happening behind the curtain of like,
totally.
Like a handful of people like accreting power over time, and like we think we're like changing.
Yeah, we got the illusion of choice. Yeah,
exactly. Now, I will concede that's partially true, but it's also partially not true. Like it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I kind of want to go beyond that though. It's like, so whether it's an illusion of power or not, like, would you agree that you know, even with, you know, an outcome being the rotation of power, like, fundamentally speaking, voting is some sort of attempt to place your say into the use of the resources and energy of a society. Is that is that technically like, you're voting, you're saying, look, I think we should do this with our resources, or I think this person should be voted so that his policies, or which are basically a manifestation of the use of energy and resources in society. Like, would we agree that that's really the end goal of voting?
Yeah, I mean, I live in a place that's got this, like, people criticize it. They say it's like too democratic. Like in California, like we don't just vote on representatives. We vote on like all kinds of random stuff.
Everything.
Like should we have this water pipe going? So what you end up having happen is that public administrators try their best to create these like packets that come into your house, and it tries to lay the pro and the con side of each one. And they do a reasonable job, but like at the end of the day, you have people who are like highly uneducated about like kidney dialysis machines, voting on whether or not there should be like a wage increase or whatever for kidney dialysis workers. So it's really like taxes on bags. Like, should there be this water pipe? Should marijuana be legal? Should it be death penalty? Like we vote on all this stuff, right? And it's like, quite, to me, the reasoning is quite obvious. It's so that a person in Sacramento can't just like make the decision, that like it has to be consensus in society. Like that seems like quite obviously the euphemistic or like charitable interpretation of what they're trying to do. The question is, does it actually produce a good outcome? And you can definitely make the case that like California has like negative things have happened here because of the system. Including the fact that people voted in the 70s to like put a freeze on, and which is funny for libertarians, but like to put essentially a freeze on property taxes. So therefore the state had less money to like spend on stuff. So it's interesting. In some cases, a democracy can actually protect the individual, right? In other cases, it leads to like, the behaviors you're talking about. But hey, I mean, people love in America, like, dude, the Bill of Rights, like, people are protected by this like democratic institution, like their their negative right to do or to not have to do certain things, right?
I guess
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Alex. Just in the last 10 minutes here, as we wrap up, I just want to sort of shift the conversation towards potential solutions, as we are in some sort of democracy now, that involve Bitcoin, and how you feel Bitcoin can play into this going forward.
But just before, I just really want to just close this voting loop, because it's really important. Is because so coming back to what I mentioned before, it's an opportunity for individuals to influence the use of resources in society, and where I guess I get hung up on voting is like a complete sham. Not just the illusion of choice, but a sham underneath it is the lack of skin in the game. So the problem you've got is, if it's a case of using resources, should the person who pays, for example, $100,000 or $200,000 in taxes, get more of a vote than the person who pays no taxes?
You're asking me that?
Yeah.
I think that's a difficult question that doesn't have a one-size-fit-all answer. But perhaps every system has tried to kind of negotiate that, right? In terms of, does you having more wealth or power determine your voice, right? So you could see that in, for example, the Senate versus the Congress, and a lot of the decision-making that went into designing America was trying to find a compromise to that. And I guess I would probably echo that. I would try to find some sort of middle ground where, because we know that economic power turns into political power, we would want to limit that to some extent. But that's not something you can have like a hot take on. It's very difficult to figure out how exactly you limit that without creating undue negative externalities.
Okay.
But no, like I don't think that like the richest I don't think that Jeff Bezos should be able to dictate like everything for everybody else just because he's richer than them. I think that there's like some sort of balance there.
Yeah. So I guess where I was going with this is, like, at the end of the day, I actually think that instead of people, putting committees together and voting on whether we should all eat Beyond Meat, like we should all just go and buy whatever the fuck meat we want to buy. So basically for me, it's like the only vote that actually matters is where you spend your money. And once again, I think what I'm getting from this conversation between us here is that it's really the line is, once again, what I mentioned at the beginning, is the separation of economics and politics. Because if we live on an economic standard, then the vote doesn't actually matter, because like you just go and you vote in like your vote manifests in terms of what the fuck you buy. Like that's like, I vote for, organic beef, 20%, 25% fat, when I go and buy it, versus some other, person votes for fucking fake meat, Beyond Meat, and, chicken nuggets that look like erasers. So it's like that vote for me is the only one that matters. And I think what we end up doing when we mix politics into society is that we conflate voting with voting, right? Like we conflate the capacity for an individual to choose where their economic energy is placed with some sort of political say. And then what you end up getting is you get all the lemmings who basically don't own shit, don't understand anything, have the ability to add a voice onto economic outcomes that they were not party to in the first place. So it kind of starts to derange society in so many ways. But I think the voting thing is such a big topic. Maybe we should save it for like a part 2. But
Sure.
I think this is I just have a hard time with it.
Yeah, just to get to Alex's point, my thesis essentially is that Bitcoin's adoption and its just inexorable rise and kind of growth in American society and global society is going to be really healthy for our system, because it will like cut out or make really like it'll disincentivize or cut out or make impossible a lot of like the worst parts about American society, which are often, like as Svetsky's been saying, are 100% political and have no economics in them at all, or whatever, I guess, to your model. So like these like unelected, unknown decisions that are made by bureaucrats who
no skin in the game.
Yeah, like we're gonna fight this war in some other country, and like the average American has no idea that that's happening, but they're paying for it with their money. Like a lot of that stuff is gonna like the opportunity to do that sort of thing sort of shrinks a little bit, at least in my mind, in a Bitcoin standard, where there has to be a little more back and forth with the people who are giving you your money to go do stuff. Like if you're living in a Bitcoin standard in the future where there still is the dollar, but the dollar's kind of necessarily kind of pegged to the amount of Bitcoin the government has, then where does the government get that Bitcoin? Well, it has to be more of like a taxation model. It's not going to be this sort of MMT type thing. So like there's going to be a closer tie between the people who are like paying the government for its services or whatever, and the government's actions. Otherwise, those people are going to get pissed. Today, there's no like mechanism for accountability for a lot of this stuff. So I'm hoping that we move to a society where like things like forever wars that take decades and cost trillions and that mortgage our future for stuff that nobody cares about in our country are just not feasible. Like it's just not feasible. Now, is a war to defend like our own territory feasible? Very, right? So it just sort of depends. But like, I think that these like excessive policies that are not helpful for the majority of the people, that only benefit a tiny few, and are all decided behind closed doors. I just think this stuff is like the opportunities for these things hopefully shrink in a Bitcoin standard would be like my final thought there.
And yeah, I would echo the exact same thing, Alex. I would say that in fact I would say that whilst I 100% agree with you on a shorter term timescale, that definitely happens. And what my hope is that on a longer term timescale, we actually move away from any sort of society in which we are subjects of a nation state whom we are born into, that we pay taxes for. Like, the society starts to fragment, localize, and as I kind of said earlier, transforms into, some sort of patchwork of a million city-states who all decide in their own sort of way, like almost like, and maybe this will rub some people the wrong way, but it's almost like, a series of competitive dictatorships, in the sense that, I own a big chunk of land and I want to run it my way. And then I, either rent to others or whatever. And then I kind of run it as like a company, and I provide the products and services. I have a contractual relationship with everyone who lives there, etc. And I kind of run it like a CEO king sort of thing. And then the territory next to me, or maybe, 5-6 territories down, they run it more like, a series of, private property enclaves, in which, they form an alliance for, you know, border protection, etc., and they have some sort of common values and rules, etc., and you sort of end up getting this patchwork. But the idea of kind of like a large scale nation state, to me, on a long enough time scale, completely disappears.
Yeah, and that's
because it's not economically feasible.
and that's fine, and we can debate that in the future. But if we go in that direction and we have a decreasing size of the nation state down to more like localized or city sized structures, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be kingdoms. Like they may actually be more kind of like similar to some, you know, some sort of balance of power structure with some sort of voting, like that might happen too. But I probably agree with you that over time the Bitcoin standard does like erode probably the size of these nation states. That would make sense because it gives power to people who are like currently like screwed over and disenfranchised. So anyway, always a pleasure chatting. A lot of fun. Thank you for having us,
course,
Bitcoin
man.
Mag. We'll do it again.
Great having you both on. I think we've left at a spot that leaves a lot to the imagination and begs for another discussion sometime in the future. So I really want to thank Aleks Gladstein and Aleks Svetski for joining me today. This has been awesome. You'll be able to see a full replay of this on YouTube immediately after. We'll make it available on Twitter as well. So Aleks and Aleks, thanks a lot. Have a great weekend, you guys.
Peace, folks. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Later.
guys. Ciao.
See you later. And I wanted to remind everyone in the spaces, we'll be going live next week at 1 p.m. Eastern every day of the week. We've got a couple more exciting debates. One of them, including Aleks Svetski again, is going to be debating BitBoy crypto. That should be, I don't even know how to describe it. It's going to be epic. Bitcoin versus crypto. I can't wait. Outside of that, we've got the Bitcoin 2022 conference. We're within 75 days until the conference, guys. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, I highly recommend you do so. Prices are going to increase. Discounts are going to decrease. Get 21% off with the promo code YTMAG. Got to do it. Got to get those tickets. See both Aleks Svetski and Aleks Gladstein speak in person, along with a host of other just total menches brains in the space. It's going to be the opportunity of a lifetime in terms of also just networking and you know, leaving your fiat job and working more toward this future however you see it. So very excited about that. Bitcoin 2022, most exciting basically party of the year. Get 21% off with promo code YTMAG. And with that, yeah, I think we'll close it out. Have a great weekend, guys, and buy the dip.